It was the winter of 1956 when the Crescent Motel burned to the ground. By dawn, only the stone foundation and a single brass key had survived the fire. Locals pitied the widow who stood watching the smoke rise, her hands still black with ash. They said she rebuilt out of loyalty, but those who lived nearby noticed she rebuilt too quickly, too precisely, using the same concrete slab her husband had poured himself. For years, travelers slept above that floor without knowing what lay beneath it. The widow kept her records neat. Her keys polished, her grief tucked into ledgers and routine. Decades later, when the plumbing crew broke through a patch of hollow ground under the hallway, the truth surfaced with the dust bones sealed in ash and a key that still fit the old room 7. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from today. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. The morning after the fire, frost still clung to the scorched timbers like white lace. The Crescent Motel lay in ruin, 12 rooms reduced to a blackened outline along the highway outside Drumheller, Alberta. Smoke drifted in thin columns from the collapsed roof, curling over the frozen gravel lot where Evelyn Krause stood wrapped in her husband's coat. Her breath showed in clouds. Her fingers trembled as she pressed the fabric tighter around her body. She hadn't slept since the fire siren stopped wailing. The local fire chief told her there was nothing left to save, no guests injured, no bodies recovered, no sign of her husband, Harold. They called it an accident. Electrical, they said. But the lines had been new and she knew that. By mid-morning, an insurance adjuster named Kelby arrived in a beige Plymouth. He wrote quick notes on a clipboard, gloved hands moving in practiced rhythm. "We'll assess the loss," he said, not meeting her eyes. "We can't rule out arson until lab confirmation." The words lab and confirmation hung strangely in the cold air, scientific detached, like something that belonged far from this quiet stretch of prairie road. Evelyn nodded, though she barely heard him. She was looking at the foundation, at a place where the concrete had cracked open like a seam. Steam rose faintly from it. The fire chief had said the ground itself was warm, as if the blaze had burrowed downward instead of spreading up. They'd never seen combustion behave that way. Subsurface heating, Kelby called it, writing fast. The next day, townsfolk brought casseroles. No one mentioned Harold. They talked about the wind, about the frost, about the loss of business to the nearby highway expansion. Someone whispered that Harold had been in debt, that maybe the insurance would cover it all nicely. Evelyn didn't answer. She kept her face still polite, her voice soft. In the following week, a snowstorm buried the site entirely. Under the drifts, the ruined motel became a white mound with 12 dark vents where chimneys had stood. Evelyn spent those days in a rented cabin, sorting through ledgers, guest names, maintenance schedules, invoices, receipts. She noticed that the log for December was incomplete. The entry for room 7 stopped halfway through a sentence. Check-in, H. Kra, and nothing more. She stared at the line until her eyes blurred. By February, the insurance check arrived. It came folded inside a stiff envelope stamped "Final Settlement." She walked to the edge of the property, ripped it open, and looked at the amount, $4,600. Enough to rebuild if she reused the foundation. Everyone said it was madness. Start over somewhere else, her sister told her. That ground's cursed, but Evelyn refused. "It's just concrete," she said. "It can't hold a curse." When the thaw came, she hired carpenters. They dug round the cracked footing and poured new cement over the old. One morning, as the crew cleared debris near the office doorway, she noticed a glint among the ash. She bent down and brushed the soot away with her bare hand. It was a motel key, brass blackened, the number 7 still visible beneath the burn. She slipped it into her coat pocket without a word. That night, she placed the key on her nightstand beside the lamp. Its metal was cold, almost oily to the touch. She wondered how it had survived when everything else, doors, linens, photographs, had turned to dust. In the silence, she could still hear the faint pop of nails cooling in the ruins. The radio played a static lullaby from somewhere beyond town, a frequency no one claimed. By spring, the new structure rose quickly. The framing went up in straight lines, precise and neat, just as Harold would have built it. Each morning at 7 a.m., she brought coffee to the carpenters, her boots crunching over packed earth. They joked that she worked faster than they did. "Can't rest until it's done," she said, and they nodded. But the men avoided the southeast corner of the site, muttering about strange resistance in the soil, how the auger sometimes stuck, as if catching on hidden metal. One afternoon, the foreman asked her if she wanted the foundation inspected before sealing the subfloor. "It feels hollow," he said. "Could be an old pipe or air pocket." Evelyn hesitated, then shook her head. "If it's hollow, fill it," she replied. He shrugged and poured the mix. As concrete flowed into the trench, she heard a soft echo beneath, like water striking metal. It lasted only a second. That night, she returned alone, lantern in hand. The floor was smooth, unblemished, pale as bone in the lamplight. She set her palm flat against it, feeling faint warmth through the surface. Maybe residual heat, maybe nothing, but she withdrew her hand quickly as if burned. Outside, the prairie wind carried the smell of thawing ash. She stood in the doorway, lantern flickering. In the distance, a train whistle rose, a single drawn-out note fading into the night. The flame wavered and went out. She walked back inside and placed the key on the counter beside the half-finished ledger from the year before. The number 7 caught the light again, faint but legible. By the end of that week, construction resumed. The walls went up, insulation nailed in, paint rolled smooth. The motel would open again by summer. Everyone praised her perseverance. Only the adjuster, when he visited one last time, seemed unsettled. "We had a note," he told her quietly, flipping through his file. "Our team logged an odor trace from the debris. Incomplete combustion markers." "What kind?" she asked. He hesitated. "Organic," he said finally. "Could be animal, could be human. Hard to tell after that kind of heat." She stared at him, eyes steady. "And you closed the file?" He nodded once. "No evidence to hold it open." She turned away, picked up the key, and slipped it into her pocket. "Then there's nothing left to find," she said. Outside, snow began to fall again, light, steady, soundless. Beneath the new floor, something hollow echoed with every hammer strike. By April, the Crescent Motel began to look alive again. Fresh siding covered the charred frame, the new sign painted in the same script her husband once traced by hand. Evelyn Krause stood by the gravel driveway, watching a delivery truck unload crates of linens and fixtures. The driver asked where to stack them. She pointed to the same office door that had melted in the fire, rebuilt now with cleaner lines. Inside, she'd arranged everything as it had been the desk. The clock, even the guest ledger on the counter. Continuity brought comfort, and comfort, she thought, could bury grief. Deputy Frank Danner stopped by each week. He was polite, broad-shouldered, a man who lingered at the threshold instead of crossing it. Just checking on progress, he'd say. He'd been the first to reach the scene that night, the one who'd found her outside in the snow screaming her husband's name. He never repeated what she'd said between sobs, only that she kept asking, "Why is the door locked from inside?" In late May, he handed her a folded paper, the fire investigation's closing summary. Cause indeterminate. Probable accidental ignition source unverified. She read it 3 times before sliding it into her drawer beneath the motel key she'd kept polished. The brass now shone clean again, only the number faintly scorched. When construction crews dismantled the last scaffold, she walked the perimeter with the foreman. "Foundation's solid," he said, tapping his clipboard. "You had some weird readings, though. One of my men said the auger hit something metal last week." "Pipes?" she asked. He frowned. "Not the water line. Too deep, probably old debris." We filled over it. That evening, Evelyn went to town for supplies. At the hardware store, 2 men fell silent when she entered. One of them whispered as she passed. "Insurance came through fast for a widow, didn't it?" She kept walking. She had grown used to the half-pitying, half-accusing glances, the town's way of saying she'd moved on too easily. By June, the Crescent Motel reopened. A few truckers checked in, grateful for clean sheets and hot coffee. Evelyn managed the front desk, kept the rooms immaculate, and spent evenings transcribing receipts into the ledger. Her handwriting, neat loops and angled letters, looked identical to her husband's. One quiet afternoon, she went to hang a set of keys on the board. The space for room 7 remained empty. She took the burned brass key from her pocket, considered it a moment, then hooked it under the glass register anyway. Guests asked about the missing room number. She told them, "We don't rent that one anymore." At 4 p.m. one Thursday, the carpenter came by to collect payment. He mentioned that the floor in front of the office door sounded odd when walked on. "Like hollow timber," he said. "You sure nothing's buried down there?" She smiled faintly. "Just history," she said, and handed him an envelope. Later that evening, she brewed coffee and sat at the desk, watching light fade through the window. She thought she heard something, an irregular tapping, faint almost like a nail rolling in a tin cup. She froze, listening. The sound stopped. She told herself it was the pipes expanding in the cooling air. Frank returned a week later in uniform this time. He brought a folder and a question. "You remember the gas delivery schedule from that week?" he asked. She blinked, uncertain. "Why, the station log shows a 50-gallon drum delivered the day after the fire," he said. "Signed by Harold." She shook her head slowly. Then it wasn't him. Could have been someone using his name, Frank said, voice low. But whoever signed it, they wanted the record clean. Evelyn leaned on the counter, tracing the edge of the key under the glass. "Records don't clean anything," she said softly. "They just make forgetting easier." That night, she dreamed of the motel before it burned Harold at the desk, his hand brushing hers as he reached for the ledger, the air heavy with smoke that hadn't yet formed. When she woke, her palm smelled faintly of iron. Over the next few weeks, she began hearing footsteps in the hallway after midnight, measured, calm, unhurried. When she rose to check, the corridor was empty. The scent of char lingered where the air should have been clean. On the morning of August 12th, the carpenter returned angry. "Your basement's sinking," he said. "Something's collapsing under there." He led her to the rear service hallway and stamped his boot on the floor. A hollow thud reverberated beneath the wood. He crouched, rapped the board again. "You hear that?" Evelyn nodded but said nothing. He insisted on drilling a test hole. She hesitated, then relented. The auger bit into the floor, turning with a mechanical grind until it struck something solid with a dull metallic clang. The carpenter frowned. "Not pipe," he murmured. "Feels like a box, maybe." They widened the hole slightly. Beneath the surface, dust drifted up, black, greasy, smelling faintly of burned oil. The carpenter leaned closer, tapping again. The sound was unmistakable, metal against metal, and under it a faint echo, as if the object beneath were hollow. He looked up. "You want me to pry it up?" She took a breath, then shook her head. "Seal it. I don't need surprises under my floor." He hesitated but obeyed, hammering a patch of new wood over the spot. When he left, she waited until dark, then brought a lantern to the hallway. She knelt and pressed her ear to the board. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then faintly, she thought she heard a soft vibration like a low hum trapped inside the concrete. She stayed there until her knees went numb. When she finally stood, she whispered to the empty hall. "You wanted to stay, didn't you?" The next morning, she found the carpenter's invoice slipped under the door. At the bottom, he'd written a note in pencil. "You've got something buried, ma'am. I'd leave it be." At 4 p.m. that same day, she heard another echo, sharper this time, coming from beneath the floor by the office door. It wasn't the sound of wood. It was the sound of metal shifting against concrete, slow and deliberate. That night, she couldn't sleep. The sound seemed to travel through the floor like a heartbeat, steady, slow, deliberate. She told herself it was the pipes again, or maybe the boiler settling in the cold. Yet something about it carried a rhythm too human. She sat at her desk until dawn, the motel key resting beside her cup, its brass surface catching the first gray light that crept through the blinds. When she finally closed her eyes, memory returned instead of sleep. The night of the fire came back in fragments, the smell of fuel, the crackle of flame, Harold's silhouette crossing the parking lot. She remembered the argument before it started, a ledger open between them. Numbers circled in red pencil. "You can't keep borrowing against the rooms," she'd said. "It's not business anymore, it's gambling." He'd smiled the way men smile when cornered, but still pretending control. "It's investment, Ev. We're expanding." Then the generator light flickered and the power died. Later, as she waited in the dark, she heard a single door slam. Then the sound of glass breaking, the rush of air and fire, spreading too fast to be accidental. She'd run outside barefoot, calling his name. The fire chief told her afterward that every guest had been accounted for except the man registered in room 7, her husband. After the investigation closed, she'd tried to forget that detail, but now, whenever she walked across the lobby, the same hollow echo reminded her of that missing room. In early September, Deputy Danner came by with an envelope of photographs. "We're closing old files," he said. "Thought you might want copies for your records." She looked through the images: blackened rafters, a twisted bed frame, melted signage. In one photo, something caught her attention, a faint outline in the ash near where the office safe had been. She tilted the photo toward the light. It looked like the corner of a metal box. "Was that ever recovered?" she asked. Frank shook his head. "We never found it. Safe must have collapsed into the foundation when the beams gave out." "Was it locked?" "Supposed to be," he said, but the handle was missing. She stared at the picture longer than she should have. The blurred form beneath the debris seemed too small for a safe, too irregular. That evening, she went through the old ledgers again. The final entry under December 22nd, 1956 stopped mid-line. "Check-in, H. Kra." She ran her finger over the unfinished letter A. The ink had bled from moisture dark as dried blood. She turned the page and found a note written in her husband's handwriting on the next sheet, faintly indented. "Don't move the slab until I say." Her pulse quickened. The message wasn't dated. She sat for a long time staring at the sentence. If it had been written before the fire, what slab had he meant? There was only one concrete pour at the Motel, the foundation. The following morning, she hired a handyman from the next town to replace some floorboards in room 8. When he pried one up, a thin smell rose, acrid, chemical, almost sweet. He wrinkled his nose. Old varnish, he guessed. But Evelyn noticed the dark residue underneath, not varnish, but soot. The grain of the wood had blackened in a way that matched the burn pattern from the original fire. Later that week, she received a letter from the insurance office. Re-evaluation complete, no further claims admissible. It was signed by Kelby, the same adjuster who'd first visited her that icy morning. She placed it in the drawer beside the key. That night, lightning lit the planes like a camera flash. For a brief second, the windows of every vacant room glowed white, the reflections moving in sequence down the hall. When the thunder followed, she thought she heard a voice whisper from beneath the boards, a single drawn-out word she couldn't make out. The next day, Frank returned, this time with something folded in brown paper. "Old receipt turned up," he said. "Fuel drum. Same signature as before. We think someone used Harold's name to order gasoline right before the fire." She looked at the date. It was stamped December 21st, 1956, 10:03 p.m. The ink smudge obscured the buyer's first initial. "Where'd you find it?" she asked. "Evidence box, mislabeled as property damage, not arson," Frank replied. "It's been sitting in archives for 10 years. Evelyn studied the signature again. It wasn't her husband's. The K curved the wrong way, slanted downward as though written by someone left-handed. Harold had been right-handed. After he left, she walked to the service corridor, lantern in hand. She crouched and tapped the floor with the handle. The same hollow sound answered back. She pressed her palm against the boards, whispering, "Who signed your name, Harold?" The wind outside picked up, rattling the Motel sign until its chain groaned. The sound deepened into a low hum that seemed to come from the floor itself. She stood motionless as dust lifted around her boots. At midnight, she wrote a note to herself in the ledger's margin, "Key 7, keep near. It wants to be found." The following morning, she woke to find the key missing from the desk. Panic flashed through her, then confusion. She searched every drawer, every pocket. Finally, she saw it resting upright in the crack between floorboards near the office door, the brass glinting faintly in the light. She knelt to pick it up. The metal was warm. When she straightened, she saw something else, a dark stain, circular just beyond the key. She touched it. Soot came away on her fingertip. Beneath it, she heard the faint scrape again, rhythmic, patient. Later, when she looked back at the old photo of the foundation, She realized what she'd mistaken for a safe corner wasn't metal at all. It was the outline of a man's belt buckle half buried in ash. And the missing slab her husband had written about was the very one she'd rebuilt on. When she finally blew out the lantern, the echo under the floor did not stop. It quickened. By the spring of 1957, the Crescent Motel was open again. New curtains, repainted doors, and a reputation that locals politely avoided mentioning. Travelers passing through Alberta stopped for a night, rarely two, praising the clean rooms and the widow's quiet efficiency. Evelyn kept the office immaculate, each pencil aligned, each key hung in perfect order. Still, the air held something that resisted cleanliness, a faint smell like singed cloth. On the day of the grand reopening, a photographer from the Drumheller Gazette arrived to take her picture. He asked her to stand by the new sign. She smiled faintly, holding the scissors for the ribbon cutting. Behind her, the foundation, Harold's foundation, stretched out like an unspoken memory. "You must be proud," the photographer said. She nodded. It's what he would have wanted. That evening, she wrote the first new entry in her ledger. March 5, 1957, Room 1, traveling salesman, single night. She noted his name, Mr. T. Heller, and his vehicle plate. She'd learned that from Harold, always record the plate number. She slid the ledger shut, brushed the dust from her fingers, and turned the key in the drawer where key 7 lay. The salesman left early the next morning, but his breakfast plate remained untouched. Hours later, he returned visibly shaken. "I forgot something," he said, eyes darting toward the hallway. "Room 8. There was someone standing in the doorway last night." Evelyn frowned. "No one else checked in." "Then maybe I dreamed it," he muttered. Sounded like humming. Low under the floor. He hesitated, then added, "Felt like the room was listening." That night, she walked the corridor alone. The boards creaked evenly under her steps, the air warm from the heating vent. When she stopped outside room 8, she thought she heard the same distant hum like breath pressed into wood. She touched the doorknob. It was cold, colder than the air around it. In May, another guest mentioned strange tapping after midnight. Evelyn recorded the comment in her private log, but didn't tell the deputy when he came for coffee the next morning. "You're keeping the place steady," he said. "Better business than most in this economy." She smiled, pouring his cup. "Still nothing on Harold?" she asked. Frank hesitated. The provincial office closed the file. They called it a loss with no remains. She nodded. "Sometimes people disappear better than they live." He studied her face. "If there's anything you remember differently about that night?" "There isn't," she said. 2 weeks later, she found a note slipped under the office door in a neat, unfamiliar hand. "You're building on bones." No signature. She burned it in the sink. By late summer, her routines had calcified into ritual. She dusted the counter each morning, polished the register bell, checked the vacancy light. Every evening at exactly 9 p.m., she locked the front door and walked the hallway with a flashlight, inspecting each latch. The beam of light always lingered over room 7's sealed threshold, now repainted to blend with the wall. The door was false hinges, removed frame plastered smooth, but she could still see where the wood had warped from heat. In August, a traveling surveyor stayed 2 nights. Over breakfast, he mentioned the motel's unusual symmetry. "Your foundation's off-center," he said. "Back corner's lower by 2 inches. Might be settling." She feigned surprise. "I'll have someone check it." But the remark gnawed at her. That afternoon, she found the old blueprint Harold had drawn years before, his pencil lines sharp precise. In the margin near the office outline, he'd written, "Reinforced slab 4x4 3 foot. A reinforcement for what?" At 7 p.m., she brought the blueprint to the office floor and laid it down exactly where she thought the slab should end. The edge of the drawing aligned with the hollow board the carpenter had patched months ago. Her pulse climbed. A week later, rain hammered the tin roof for 3 straight nights. On the 4th morning, she found a dark streak creeping down the wall between rooms 7 and 8. The plaster was damp, bleeding a slow brown stain. She touched it, then sniffed her fingers, metallic, acrid, faintly oily. She opened the nearest vent and caught a brief whiff of something worse, burned hair. She called the county maintenance office. A man came with instruments and a clipboard. He removed the grate, shone a flashlight, and frowned. No obstruction, he said. Just residue. Probably old smoke sealed in the ducts. He scribbled notes and left. But when Evelyn passed by the vent that night, she thought she saw movement inside, dust shifting as if stirred by breath. The next morning, she stood by the office window watching the horizon. A lone car approached a Buick dark blue, the kind Harold used to drive. Her hand tightened around the key in her pocket until the edge cut her palm. But the car passed without slowing, leaving only exhaust in its wake. That afternoon, she locked the office early. The ledger sat open on the counter page marked by a fountain pen. Across the empty column for room 7, she wrote a single word in neat script, reserved. At dusk, thunder rolled low and heavy across the plains. The storm hadn't yet arrived, but the motel lights flickered as if anticipating it. Evelyn went to the hallway one last time before bed. The false door gleamed faintly under the emergency bulb. She pressed her hand against the plaster where the handle used to be. For a moment, she swore she felt vibration beneath her palm, steady, rhythmic, like something on the other side knocking back. She left her hand there longer than she should have, until the light bulb buzzed and went out. In the dark, she whispered, "I'm still here." And from somewhere beneath her feet, a single deliberate knock answered. By 1959, the motel had weathered 2 winters and a flood that washed out the lower fields. The Crescent stood firm, its white paint dulled by wind and dust, but business was steady enough to keep her afloat. Evelyn Krause had grown older in quiet ways. New lines around the eyes, slower movements, a stillness that unnerved the younger guests. She no longer smiled for the local paper. She rarely left the property at all. The county inspector arrived that spring to evaluate structural safety. He carried a clipboard and a dull authority, walking through the rooms one by one. "You've got settling," he said, kneeling to tap a measuring rod along the floor of the main hallway. "Ground's uneven under this corner." He marked a small cross near the office door. "Might need underpinning next year. Frost heave, most likely." Evelyn followed him, watching every motion. "It hasn't shifted since the rebuild," she said. He shrugged. "Soil's unpredictable out here." Then he added almost absently, "Strange trace readings in the ground mix, though high calcium like lime or bone. Could just be mineral drift." He left her with a fine notice and the faint smell of chalk from the ground sampler he'd used. That night, she examined the hallway by lamplight. The cracks in the tile formed a branching pattern, thin and deliberate, as if the earth beneath were drawing something upward. She traced one line with her finger until it met the false door where room 7 had once been. The seam along the frame was widening, a hairline split in the plaster that hadn't been there before. In June, a passing salesman's dog bolted as soon as they reached the lobby. The animal's hackles rose, teeth bared, toward the floorboards. "He's never done that before," the man said, tugging the leash. Evelyn said nothing. She could feel the faint tremor underfoot again, like a low hum. Later that night, she sat at the desk, reading her old ledger. Across a decade of pages, her handwriting remained steady, but the ink had darkened over time. She flipped to the burned page, the one with her husband's unfinished entry, and noticed faint indentations below it. Tilting the book toward the lamp, she saw a second hidden message impressed from the sheet beneath. "Cover it before morning." The letters were shallow, uneven, written as if by a shaking hand. For the first time in years, she unlocked the drawer and took out key 7. The metal had tarnished again, edges greenish with corrosion. She rubbed it clean with a cloth, then held it to her ear. Absurd, childish, yet she thought she heard a faint ring, a resonance like a struck tuning fork. She set it down quickly. The next day, she hired a mason from Calgary to assess the cracking tiles. He crouched, tapping gently with his hammer. "You've got voids down here," he said. "Air pockets or something buried shallow." He pried up a single tile. Beneath it, the subfloor looked darker than the rest, gray, shot through with black veins. "Could be burn residue," he said. "You rebuild on old ash." She didn't answer. He patched the area and left before dusk, muttering about bad ground. That night, the storm came again, wind moaning across the eaves. Evelyn walked the corridor, with her flashlight pausing where the mason had lifted the tile. The patch gleamed faintly wet. She crouched down and touched the grout, still warm. The air filled with that same odor, faint, chemical, half-sweet. In the morning, she called the inspector's office to request a copy of his soil report. The clerk hesitated. "It's marked as incomplete," he said. "The sample was misplaced. We logged trace calcium phosphate, but the lab couldn't determine origin." "You want us to reopen it?" "No," she said. "That won't be necessary." She hung up, then sat at her desk, staring at the empty slot on the key rack where 7 used to hang. By August, she noticed something else. The ground around the motel's back lot, sagging inward, forming a shallow depression. Weeds grew taller there, green and thick, as if the soil was feeding on itself. When Frank Danner stopped by, she pointed it out. "Could be runoff," he said, squinting. "Could be something buried rotting underneath." "You sure you never used lime in your rebuild mix?" She hesitated. "No." "Why?" He kicked at the dirt. "Lime eats everything. Good for covering smells." She met his eyes, but he looked away first. That night, unable to stop herself, she went outside with a spade. The moon was low, the air cold. She knelt by the hollow and dug 2 shovelfuls before the metal struck something solid. The clang reverberated through her hands. She leaned down, brushed the soil aside. A rusted fragment of metal surfaced, curved, narrow, almost like the edge of a tool or a buckle. She buried it again before dawn. The next morning, guests noticed the smell. Not rot, something sharper, like smoke trapped in plaster. Evelyn told them the furnace vent had backed up. She called no repairman. By September, the hairline crack along the hallway had widened enough to cast its own shadow. The dog that had refused to enter weeks earlier appeared again with a different traveler. This time it howled at the base of the false door. The man yanked the leash and apologized, but Evelyn's pulse didn't settle until they left. That evening, she poured tea and stared at the wall until dusk turned the plaster gold. Then she whispered, "I built over you, didn't I?" The house didn't answer, but the wind outside shifted, and the key on her desk trembled slightly where it lay. At exactly 4 p.m. the next day, a thunderclap shook the building, and a thin line of dust dropped from the ceiling above the false door, settling over the brass key like ash. By 1966, the motel had begun to fade into the landscape. The highway bypass had been built farther east, and the Crescent now sat on a forgotten service road where only freight trucks passed. The neon sign flickered weakly at night, the vacancy tube never quite lighting. Evelyn Krauss stayed anyway, running the place with mechanical precision. She was 50 now, her hair pulled tight in a bun, her eyes dry from the dust. Guests came infrequently, mostly salesmen, oil surveyors, and sometimes students chasing stories about forgotten fires. One of them, a journalism student from Edmonton, arrived in October to research post-war rebuilding projects. He was polite, too curious, and carried a camera around his neck. He asked if she remembered the fire of '56. "People say it was electrical," he said, "but old county archives hint otherwise." She told him accidents happen, that memories burn cleaner than truth. He smiled nervously and changed the subject to architecture. "May I take a look at the floor plan?" he asked. She allowed him into the hallway, watching from the office. He ran his fingers along the walls, noting cracks with almost forensic care. When he reached the false door, the place where room 7 had once stood, he paused. "Odd symmetry," he murmured. "Why wall off a room entirely?" "It's storage," she said quickly. "The space is unstable." He crouched, touching the baseboard. "Looks reinforced." "Concrete. Old design," she replied. "My husband preferred the solid foundations." He looked up at her eyes, narrowing slightly. "You rebuilt exactly where it burned?" "Yes," he nodded, scribbling something into his notebook. "You must be brave." When he left that evening, the echo of his car faded into silence that felt too deep. She closed the office, bolted the doors, and sat at the desk, staring at the old ledger. She'd kept them all, one for each year, stacked neatly in a cabinet. Their pages smelled of dust and faint smoke. She ran a finger along the spines, stopped at 1956, and opened it to the last entry again. The unfinished line hadn't faded, but something new caught her eye. Faint smudge marks along the lower margin, like fingerprints pressed into the paper. The next morning, she heard hammering near the back lot. A local contractor had arrived unannounced, to inspect the old septic line after a small sinkhole formed. "Routine check," he said. "We'll be digging near the east foundation." Evelyn tried to refuse, but safety codes had changed. By noon, the workers were breaking the ground. She watched from the office window as the men uncovered layers of black soil. "Funny," one said. "Shah down this deep." They stopped to smoke their boots, leaving prints in the soft earth. At 3 p.m. thunder rolled over the prairie again. She felt it through the floor, a deep vibration that wasn't thunder alone. She set her hand on the counter and whispered, "Not today." The workers left before dusk, leaving their tools against the wall. When she went to lock up, she noticed the smallest thing, a print of a boot at the hallway's end, half-dried mud, shaped like the sole of an old work shoe. It led directly to the false door and stopped. No prints came back out. That night, lightning split the sky. The motel lights flickered, then steadied. Evelyn lit a lantern and went to the hallway. The plaster along the false door pulsed faintly, as if breathing with the rhythm of the wind. She touched it. Warm. In the lantern's glow, she saw something, a shadow just beyond the wall, faint upright. Not a trick of light, but a depth. She stepped back, heart hammering. Outside, the contractor's trench filled with rainwater. Under the surface, objects glimmered, scraps of metal glass, fragments of charred wood. She leaned closer and saw something else, a rounded piece of enamel, half buried in the mud, curved like part of a tooth. She staggered back and fell to her knees. The rain poured harder, drumming against the roof until the sound drowned everything else. By morning, she convinced herself it was nothing, a shard of porcelain, maybe from a sink. She told the workers to cover the hole and pour concrete. "It's dangerous," she said. "Seal it." They shrugged and obeyed. That evening, she poured whiskey into her teacup and sat by the desk. The key lay before her, its brass surface dulled by years of handling. She studied the number 7, faint but still visible. "You always said this room was lucky," she whispered. "Lucky for what?" She picked up the ledger and began flipping through it, faster and faster pages, fluttering like wings. Between the sheets, a folded paper slipped out, a copy of an old repair estimate dated December 21st, 1956. The handwriting was Harold's. At the bottom, he'd scrawled, "Foundation poured deeper than spec. Keep quiet." She stared until the ink blurred. At 9 p.m., she heard the familiar creak under the office floor. She leaned down, pressing her ear against the boards. The echo came back, soft but clear metal against stone, as if something was being dragged slowly beneath her. She whispered into the darkness. "Stop." The sound stopped. When she rose, she saw that the ledger had fallen open to the last page on its own. A single drop of water, no, not water, dark, almost rust-colored, had landed on the line. It spread slowly across the word "reserved," forming a small, perfect circle. Outside, wind swept across the highway, carrying the smell of wet ash and soil. She turned off the lamp, unable to stand the light. That night, in the dream that followed, she was standing beside the half-rebuilt foundation again, holding the key. Only now the ground was open, the slab removed. Below it lay nothing but darkness and a faint flicker of red. When she woke, the lantern on her nightstand was lit, though she hadn't touched it. And in the silence before dawn, she swore she heard someone knocking 3 times, slow and patient, directly from beneath the floor. By the summer of 1969, time had stripped the motel of color. The red shutters had faded to rust, the gravel lot gone to weeds. The bypass now carried every traveler around Drumheller, leaving the crescent stranded like a ghost at the end of an unused road. Evelyn Krause kept the rooms ready anyway. She laundered the sheets, polished the register, replaced bulbs in rooms no one entered. Routine was her defense. Silence was her guest. When the plumbing failed that August, she called a local contractor, Harlan Cates, a wiry man in his 40s with a habit of whistling when he worked. He crawled under the main hall with a flashlight, muttering about old copper joints and lazy welds. An hour passed before he emerged, face streaked with dust. "You got more than pipe down there," he said, uneasy. "Looks like burned timber, charred clean through." Evelyn's throat tightened. "Leftovers from the old structure," she said. He shook his head. "No, ma'am. These are fresh cuts. The wood was sealed over but never replaced." He paused, then added, "There's metal down there too." Not pipe metal flat irregular. Want me to dig it out? Her voice stayed calm. No, just reroute the line. Cates looked at her for a long moment, then shrugged. Your dime. He set his wrench down, whistling again to break the tension. By afternoon, he called through the vent. We'll need to saw through part of this slab. Evelyn's hand froze over the register. Why? Pipe's too close to something solid, he said. Feels like a box or panel. You sure there ain't storage built under this? Her heart hammered. No storage. Still, the saw began to hum, its metal teeth grinding through the concrete. After 5 minutes, it stopped abruptly. Hit something, Cates called. Too dense for slab. You'd better see this. Evelyn approached the air, heavy with grit. The cut revealed a wedge of blackened wood. It gleamed slightly under his flashlight, soaked in something dark. Creosote, he asked. Why would that be under here? She said nothing. He reached for his pry bar, wedged it in, and levered upward. A brittle crack sounded, releasing a smell she hadn't breathed in 13 years. Acrid chemical, unmistakably scorched. Cates gagged. Hell, that's not creosote, he muttered. That's bone dust. Her voice broke. Cover it. Please. He glanced at her, startled. You want this filed, just fix the pipes. That night, Evelyn waited until the motel was silent. The boards over the cut had been nailed back loosely. She knelt beside them, fingertips trembling. The smell lingered faint, but undeniable. She lifted a single nail and peered into the gap. The flashlight's beam caught something, a shape half buried in concrete dust, curved metal, rusted, ringed by white flakes. She couldn't tell if it was a buckle, a handle, or bone. When she lowered the light, her reflection wavered in a thin pool of water collecting inside the hole. For an instant, it seemed to ripple from below. The next morning, the county office arrived uninvited. 2 men in tan uniforms carrying a typed notice. Structural hazard report, one said. Ground displacement noted from the last inspection. They wanted to perform a soil analysis. Evelyn protested, but they cited public safety. She watched as they drilled near the foundation, each core sample bagged and labeled. Their conversation was brisk, impersonal. Layer 2's off-color one remarked, "Smells burnt." She pretended not to hear. That evening, Deputy Danner stopped by again, older. Now his hair turned gray at the temples. You all right, Ev? He asked. Heard about the inspection. They're wasting time, she said, pouring him coffee. The only thing under this place is concrete. He looked toward the hallway. You ever think about selling? You could move closer to your sister. Her expression didn't change. This is my ground, Frank. I built it with my hands. He sighed, reached for the sugar tin, and froze. Inside, buried beneath the cubes, lay a strip of charred leather, small, brittle, almost like the edge of a belt. He looked at her, puzzled. She took the tin from him gently. Old repair scrap, she said, returning it to the shelf. The next day, the county halted construction until further notice. Evelyn signed the paperwork without reading it. That night, rain began again, steady and cold. She walked the empty corridor barefoot, the floor cool beneath her soles. As she passed the patched section, she heard the faintest whisper of shifting stone. She crouched, pressing her ear to the floor. Beneath the boards, something creaked, not alive, but not dead either. At 10:45 p.m., headlights swept across the front window. She thought it might be the inspectors returning, but no engine followed. Only the sound of gravel shifting like unseen tires rolling over the lot. When she stepped outside, the yard was empty, save for a single fresh footprint in the mud pointed toward the office door. Inside, she noticed the key rack swaying slightly as if brushed by a passing hand. The keys rattled once, then stilled. The space where number 7 had hung years ago was empty again. At dawn, she found it lying at the foot of the false door, its brass dulled to near black. She picked it up, turned it over in her palm. The engraved number had almost vanished, but the metal was warm as though recently held. In the distance, the county truck idled on the road, waiting to resume work. The foreman stepped out, raising a clipboard. Mrs. Krause, he called. We're starting the dig today. She closed her hand around the key. You'll do no such thing, she said. But the men ignored her, lowering their shovels to the dirt. The first strike echoed through the hall like thunder, rattling the glass in the office door. She flinched, clutching the key to her chest. By noon, they had opened a trench. One of them shouted, voice sharp, almost fearful. Found something. Evelyn walked out slowly. The foreman's flashlight illuminated a pocket of charred soil, and within it, metallic glint, irregular, unmistakably human in shape. The foreman turned to her, pale. "Ma'am, this doesn't look right," she whispered. "No, it doesn't." And the wind picked up, carrying the smell of burned wood and something else older, hidden, rising at last through the cracks. By the time the county officials returned with their trucks, the motel was surrounded by tape. The words, "Excavation Zone," hung where vacancy once glowed. Evelyn stood behind the office window, watching the scene unfold, her face unreadable. The trench that began as plumbing repair had deepened overnight into something else entirely, a dig site. At 9 a.m., the forensic team arrived from Calgary, 3 men in khaki field jackets, a woman with a clipboard and camera. They spoke in careful, clipped tones, avoiding her eyes. Evelyn poured coffee for the deputy who had been posted at the property line. "They found more beneath the slab," Frank said quietly. "We need to keep you off the floor until they finish the assessment." "Assessment," she repeated, as if the word itself could contain what they had uncovered. By mid-morning, the first fragment was lifted from the soil, a blackened bone, small, curved, still flecked with gray ash. One of the men held it up with gloved fingers, murmuring, "Cortical structures human." Evelyn's knees weakened. She steadied herself on the counter. The team moved systematically, scraping away layers of soil with trowels and brushes. The earth was darker near the center of the slab, almost oily. A dull metallic odor filled the air. Iron rust, something else beneath it that none of them named. Cameras clicked, bags rustled. The sound was steady, procedural, inhumanly calm. When they struck something larger, the work stopped. The foreman crouched, brushing the dirt gently away. A boot appeared, or what was left of one fused with melted leather. Next came the remnants of denim cloth, and finally a belt buckle warped by heat. Evelyn stared at it and whispered, "He never wore one like that." But the deputy's face said otherwise. The coroner arrived at 1 p.m. He was an older man with careful eyes, his clipboard heavy with forms. "We'll need to cordon off this area," he told her. "For your own sake, you should step back inside." She obeyed, moving slowly to the office. Through the window, she could see the outline of a body emerging from beneath her hallway, bones blackened, fused to debris, one hand still bent at an unnatural angle toward the surface. When the investigators lifted the remains, something small clinked free from the ash, a ring of brass half buried in the silt. A technician picked it up, brushed it clean, and froze. "It's a key," he said. "Number 7, murmured the woman with the clipboard. Every sound drained from the air. Evelyn watched as they placed the key on a tagged cloth, photographing it beside the bones. Later, she sat in the sheriff's car while the coroner made his statement. "Adult, male," he said. "Estimated height matches Harold Krauss. Signs of blunt trauma to the skull prior to fire exposure. Post-mortem position indicates the body was already on the floor before the slab was poured." Frank glanced toward her, eyes full of questions he couldn't voice. She said nothing. At sunset, the motel looked skeletal. The earth opened, the floorboards peeled back. Reporters had already arrived, camera flashes stuttering against the glass. One called out, "Mrs. Krauss, is it true they found your husband?" She didn't answer. She looked down at her hands instead, trembling faintly. A layer of black dust covered her skin like soot. When the last team left for the night, she wandered the hall in near darkness. The trench was roped off with yellow tape, but she stepped over it, drawn to the edge. Moonlight caught the surface of the soil, still wet, glimmering faintly. At the bottom of the pit, the shape of the missing foundation section was clear, a rectangular void lined with char and metal shards. It looked less like a grave and more like a vault. A single evidence flag marked the place where the key had been found. Someone had left it behind by mistake, a small white tag with E17 printed in pencil. She knelt, touching the disturbed earth, then pressed her hand to the spot where the bones had lain. The soil was still warm. When she rose, her palm was streaked black. Inside the office, she found the ledger where she'd last written "reserved." She turned the page, dipped her pen in ink, and wrote a new line beneath it. "Checkout confirmed." Then she closed the book, wrapped it in a cloth, and placed it in the drawer beside the insurance letter, the burned photograph, and the cracked glass from the nightstand she'd salvaged from the fire 13 years earlier. Outside, she heard movement again, not the steady rhythm of work, but a slow scraping sound from under the far wall. She turned off the lamp and listened. The air shifted, settling into a long, hollow sigh. At 11:45 p.m., headlights swept across the gravel. A Calgary police sedan stopped in front. 2 officers stepped out their flashlights, cutting white paths through the dark. One held a manila envelope. Mrs. Krause, the taller one, said, "We'll need you to come with us." She nodded once calmly, as though she had been expecting it. Behind her, the light from the open door fell across the floor, illuminating the outline of a dark square, the new hole in the slab. The brass key on the evidence cloth gleamed once, then faded to shadow. Outside, the wind rose again, carrying with it the faint smell of ash and rain. And from somewhere deep beneath the motel, as they led her away, came one last soft sound. Not movement, not wind, but a slow, deliberate creak, like a door finally closing. The next morning, the motel was empty except for the officers sealing off the property. Dust hung suspended in the air like fine gray snow. Yellow tape fluttered across the parking lot, stretching from post to post. Through the window of the sheriff's office, Evelyn Krause sat motionless, her hands folded in her lap, the smell of smoke and rain still clinging to her coat. Frank Danner entered quietly, closing the door behind him. He'd aged too, his badge scuffed, his eyes clouded with exhaustion. On the table before her lay a series of photographs, fragments of bone, a warped buckle, the charred outline of a skull. "We've completed identification," he said softly. "Dental charts from 1956. The jaw structure matches Harold." Evelyn didn't blink. "He's been under my feet for 13 years, she said, and no one thought to look. Frank shifted uncomfortably. "The coroner's report shows blunt trauma fracture behind the ear, consistent with a fall or a strike. But there's something else. The fire started after death. We can't explain how the remains ended up sealed in concrete." "You think I put him there?" she said flatly. "I think someone did," he replied. "We found evidence that the foundation was poured twice. Once before the fire, once after. And the paperwork." He slid a faded carbon copy across the table. Her husband's signature wavered across the page, dated December 21st, 1956, the night before the fire. Beneath it, an unfamiliar hand had added, "Second pour complete." Evelyn looked down at the line, tracing it with her fingertip. "He wasn't a builder," she whispered. "He hired men off the road." Frank studied her face. "Do you remember anyone else there that week?" "Only his partner," she said. "Louis Reeve." Frank nodded slowly. "We've been trying to find him. He disappeared the winter after the fire, but his farm records list 2 missing drums of gasoline." Evelyn closed her eyes. The smell of the motel floor returned, the metallic heat, the hint of fuel trapped in the walls. She remembered the night Harold had gone out for air, the way he'd said, "Don't come out until the noise stops." "Maybe he meant to burn it all," she murmured. But someone finished the job for him. The forensic officer entered with a stack of evidence bags. "Recovered items from beneath the slab," he said. "These were preserved better than expected." He laid them out one by one, a melted wristwatch stopped at 10:03 p.m., a wallet charred but intact, and finally a small envelope marked E17. Inside was the motel key number 7. Evelyn stared at it. The brass was dulled but legible, the engraving faintly scored by scratches. She reached for it instinctively, but the officer stopped her. "Evidence," he said. "I understand." Her voice trembled for the first time. "You'll need it for the trial." The word trial hung between them, heavy and unreal. Later that day, she gave her statement. The stenographer's keys clacked softly as she spoke how Harold had gambled away the motel's savings, how arguments had grown bitter, how the insurance policy had been renewed 2 weeks before the fire. She recounted the night of the explosion, the screams, the smell, but she never once said she saw him die. When it was over, Frank turned off the recorder. "You'll be called as a witness," he said. She nodded. "Not a suspect, not yet." She was released that evening. The sun had fallen behind the prairie hills, leaving the sky a dull violet. The motel loomed in silhouette, roped off lifeless, yet somehow watching her. The next morning, reporters swarmed. Headlines read, "Remains found in Motel Foundation widow to testify." She ignored them, staying at a boarding house 2 towns over. The walls there smelled of paint and lemon cleaner, foreign scents she couldn't bear. Every night she dreamed of the floor opening beneath her, of something rising through it, slow and deliberate. 2 weeks later, Frank arrived with an update. Reeves' handwriting matches the falsified documents, he said. Bank slips show he withdrew cash from a joint account 3 days before the fire. The chemists confirmed the accelerant on the site came from drums registered to his farm. Evelyn exhaled slow and uneven. "Then he killed him," she whispered. "It looks that way," Frank said. "But the jury will need proof. The key, the one found under your slab, it connects the body to your building. The prosecution thinks it proves Reeves sealed him there to fake a disappearance and collect the payout." She looked at him for a long time. "And you? What do you think?" Frank hesitated. "I think you've lived with a ghost for 13 years, Ev. And maybe now he can rest." That night, alone in her room, she lit a candle and set the motel key beside it. The flame reflected in its surface, flickering like an eye. She whispered, "They'll know the truth now. You can stop knocking." But even as she spoke, a soft rattle came from the window pane. She turned toward the sound, 3 quiet taps, evenly spaced. Outside, rain began to fall, darkening the street to ash. In the distance, sirens rose from the direction of the courthouse, and for the first time in 13 years, she allowed herself to weep. At the sheriff's office, an evidence clerk sealed envelope E17 in a box labeled State Far Reeve. The key rested inside its number, faint but legible. The last line of the chain of custody form read, "Admitted for trial." The trial of State v. Reeve began on a cold morning in January 1970. Snow fell over the courthouse steps, melting into the seams of the stone. Inside, the air smelled of paper and coffee, bureaucratic, impersonal. For Evelyn Krauss, it felt more like a confession chamber than a court. She sat behind the prosecution table, hands folded, the brass motel key sealed in a clear evidence bag beside her. The number 7 gleamed faintly through the plastic haloed by flashbulbs. Reporters crowded the aisles, notebooks poised. The words "buried alive" had already appeared in headlines across Alberta. The public wanted spectacle. The widow in gray, the missing partner found guilty. The story sold itself. Louis Reeve entered in handcuffs, heavier now, his once slick hair gone to silver. He didn't look at her. His expression carried neither guilt nor anger, only fatigue. His lawyer whispered to him as he sat down, voice too low to hear. The Crown opened with a timeline, financial debt insurance policies falsified, construction invoices. They displayed photographs of the burned motel, the double-poured foundation, the recovered bones. Evelyn kept her eyes forward. Then came the forensic testimony. A young chemist explained that accelerant traces found in the soil matched samples from Reeves' farm. Diesel residue stabilized compound, he said. Not accidental combustion. Deliberate ignition. The defense objected, claiming cross-contamination after 13 years. The judge overruled. Next came the osteologist, who described the fractures in Harold Krauss's skull, angled, forceful, inflicted before fire exposure. No sign of defensive wounds, he said, likely struck from behind. The courtroom fell silent, except for the ticking of the wall clock. Evelyn gripped the edge of her seat until her knuckles whitened. Finally, the clerk opened the evidence box and withdrew E17. The key lay on a white cloth under the lights, dull yet commanding. Recovered beneath the primary foundation, the prosecutor said. Catalogued alongside skeletal remains and property artifacts. Stamped number 7. The victim's personal item last seen in his possession. Reeves' eyes flicked toward it for the first time. His jaw tightened. The prosecutor leaned forward. Mr. Reeve, your statement claims you left the property before the fire began. Yet this key was found beneath a concrete slab poured under your supervision. Would you explain how it got there? Reeve looked past the counsel table, past the jury, straight at Evelyn. His voice came out hoarse but steady. He asked me to hide it. Gasps rippled through the gallery. The prosecutor frowned. To hide what, Mr. Reeve? Reeve's lips trembled. Not the key, him. Evelyn's heart slammed against her ribs. Reeve continued, eyes glazed. He owed men from Edmonton more than $10,000. Said they'd come for both of us if he couldn't pay. He planned the fire himself, insurance, clean slate, new name. Told me to seal the old slab to make it look like nothing survived. He poured the mix himself that night. Then how do you explain the skull fracture? The prosecutor snapped. Reeve's gaze dropped. Because he changed his mind, he whispered. He tried to stop me. His voice broke. I panicked. The judge ordered recess. Outside the courtroom, snow fell harder, muffling the town into silence. Evelyn stood in the corridor, eyes on the tiled floor. Frank approached quietly. You believe him? I believe he buried a lie, she said. And then me along with it. When court reconvened, the jury looked hollow-eyed. They'd seen the photographs, the soil samples, the financial ledgers. The Crown called one final witness, a handwriting expert, who confirmed that the falsified signatures on the construction forms were Reeve's, not Harold's. After 3 hours of deliberation, the verdict came back guilty of manslaughter and arson. Reeve didn't speak when the sentence was read. He only turned once toward Evelyn as the bailiff led him away. For a moment, she thought she saw gratitude flicker in his expression, like a man relieved that the truth, however ugly, had finally surfaced. Outside, reporters swarmed her again. Mrs. Krause. Did justice prevail? One shouted. She answered quietly. Justice burns slower than fire. That evening, Frank drove her back to the motel site to collect her belongings. The building had been emptied, furniture gone walls stripped. Only the concrete remained cracked and pale beneath the snow. He waited in the car while she walked inside. In the office, the faint outline of the trench was still visible. She knelt where the slab had been broken, brushing her fingers through the powdery dust. Something metallic glimmered under the surface. She dug gently until the edge of another key emerged, smaller, unnumbered, tarnished, nearly black. She lifted it to her palm. The tag was gone, but she knew its weight. She whispered, "One for the grave, one for the lock." When she returned to the car, Frank looked at her hands. You find anything? Just what was left behind. He nodded and drove off the road ahead, vanishing into fog. Neither spoke again. At the evidence vault 2 days later, the court clerk catalogued E17 into permanent storage. Crescent Motel, 1956 case closed, he muttered, sealing the box with red wax. The last record in the ledger read, recovered, preserved, archived. The final note typed beneath it read, Item Motel Key Number 7 admitted as Exhibit C. When the sentence was handed down, reporters called it the Motel Burial Case. The name stuck longer than anyone involved. Louis Reeve was sent to Bowden Institution for life. The newspapers ran his photograph beside an image of the recovered key, the headline reading, Truth Unearthed After 13 Years Under Concrete. For a few weeks, Evelyn's phone rang non-stop, journalists, historians, even a radio producer from Toronto wanting to dramatize the case. She unplugged the line and never reconnected it. By spring, she sold the property to a highway contractor. The buyer promised to demolish what remained, pave the ground, and turn the land into storage for equipment. She didn't watch them tear it down. She signed the deed and walked away with a small box of personal items, the ledger, her husband's wristwatch, and the second key she'd found embedded in dust after the trial. She never told anyone about that one. She moved east to a town near the river, renting a narrow house above a laundromat. The landlord thought she was a retired school teacher. She let him think that. Routine rebuilt itself mornings at the market afternoons, tending plants on the windowsill nights, listening to the trains pass. Yet each sound of iron wheels on track reminded her of that faint echo under the motel floor, the steady rhythm that had followed her even after the slab was broken. Sometimes she would wake before dawn, reach for the drawer where she kept the key and find it warm as if freshly held. The following year, a letter arrived from the Department of Justice. Property Release Authorization Exhibit C, it stated that certain evidence items not essential to permanent record could be returned to rightful owners. She traveled back to Drumheller, only once taking the morning train. At the courthouse, a clerk led her down a narrow corridor lined with steel cabinets. "You're here for E17, he said. He opened a drawer, flipped through folders, and withdrew a small envelope sealed with tape. Inside was the motel key, dull, scratched, the number almost erased. He held it out. "You can take it." Evelyn studied it under the fluorescent light. The metal bore faint indentations she hadn't noticed before, like teeth marks or pressure lines. She accepted it, thanked the clerk, and stepped back into the daylight. Outside, the sky was pale and the wind sharp. She walked to the ruins of the old highway. The Crescent Motel was gone, replaced by an empty field of gravel. Only the faint outline of the foundation remained, grass pushing through the cracks. She stood there for a long time, listening to the wind hum across the open lot. "You're free now," she whispered. In the distance, a car engine started echoing faintly, like the sound of a generator. That night, she checked into a small inn on the edge of town. The room was clean, anonymous floral curtains, a ticking clock. The same scent of detergent she remembered from her own rooms decades before. She placed the key on the bedside table beside the watch that had stopped at 10:03 p.m. For the first time in years, she slept without dreams. When she woke, sunlight filled the room. The key was gone. Panic surged. She tore through her bag, pulled back the sheets. Nothing. She went to the window and saw a shadow move past the hallway outside. A cleaner, perhaps, or something else. She checked the hall. Empty. But at the far end, resting on the floor beneath the exit sign, was the key. It faced upward, perfectly centered. She walked toward it slowly. The number had reappeared, faint but unmistakable, 7. She didn't pick it up. Instead, she knelt, whispered, "Stay here," and walked back to her room. When she left the inn the next morning, the key was still there, glinting faintly in the light. Years passed. She never married again. She sent donations under false names to the families of fire victims listed in old newspapers. Sometimes she would receive thank you notes she never opened. When she died in 1985, the coroner's report described a quiet passing, natural causes, no relatives. Her belongings fit into one cardboard box. Inside it, along with faded photographs and a pair of gloves, the attendants found a small tag envelope marked in her handwriting, "Return to Storage Exhibit C." The brass key lay within, cool and weightless. The number 7 had vanished entirely, but under bright light, an impression could still be seen, shallow yet precise, as if pressed from the inside out. The archivist filed it without comment, placing it back into the same drawer it had left 15 years earlier. He closed the cabinet, turned off the light, and left. Behind the steel door, something shifted faintly, a dull metallic sound like a key turning in a lock. By 1986, 30 years after the fire, the Crescent Motel existed only as a story told by strangers. The site had been flattened, overgrown with prairie grass. Truckers passing the stretch sometimes mentioned that their radios hissed when driving by a burst of static at the exact spot where the office once stood. No one stopped anymore. That summer, a small television crew from Vancouver arrived to film a regional true crime series called Forgotten Fires. They'd read about Evelyn Krause's case in an old newspaper archive. The producer wanted one last look at where truth and rumor buried each other. They found the coordinates easily. The field was barren except for a half-collapsed fence and a patch of concrete still embedded in the dirt. The cameraman sat up near the old foundation, his lens trained on the horizon. "Hard to believe this was ever a business," he said. The air shimmered with heat, the silence immense. At noon, the reporter Diane Alcott, woman 2, late 30s, sharp-eyed, composed, began her narration. In 1956, a fire consumed the Crescent Motel outside Drumheller, Alberta. 13 years later, the body of its owner was discovered entombed beneath the rebuilt floor, turning what had been called an accident into one of Canada's most haunting homicide cases. She gestured toward the ground. It was here that the widow Evelyn Krause lived for more than a decade without knowing what lay beneath her. Or perhaps she always knew. The cameraman zoomed in on the concrete. Embedded in its surface, half buried in dust, something caught the light, small, metallic, irregular. He crouched, brushed away dirt with his sleeve, and drew a sharp breath. "Diane," he said, "you'll want this in frame." It was a brass key. Corroded edges, softened number barely visible. 7, she read aloud. The producer frowned. "Prop planted by kids, maybe?" "No," Diane murmured. "Too deep in the pour." Look at the oxidation decades old. They recorded a slow close-up. The lens captured every scratch, the faint glint of the engraving. When the sunlight shifted, the number vanished, then reappeared again, as if the metal itself were breathing. After the shoot, Diane walked the perimeter while the crew packed their gear. She found herself standing by a depression in the soil where weeds grew taller, greener than the rest. She crouched, touched the earth warm, though the day was cooling. She felt a pulse beneath it, a vibration too steady to be wind. That evening, the crew returned to town. At the local diner, the waitress recognized their equipment. "You filming that motel case?" she asked. "My uncle used to say the ground there hums at night. Folks hear tapping from under the gravel. Maybe the widow never left." They laughed uneasily. Back at the editing bay, Diane reviewed the footage. When the key came into focus, a faint sound leaked through the mic channel. Not wind, not static, but 3 soft knocks spaced evenly apart. She turned up the gain. The waveform spiked clear and deliberate. She rewound, replayed. The same 3 knocks, each followed by a brief metallic ring. No one else in the room seemed to notice. At 11:45 a.m. the next day, she returned alone to the site with a handheld recorder. The field was silent heat rising from the soil. She crouched where the key had been pressed record and waited. Minutes passed. A breeze stirred the grass. Then faintly from beneath her, a slow creak, like something shifting deep underground. She stood quickly, heart racing, and turned off the device. When she looked down, the key was gone. Back in Vancouver, the episode aired 2 months later. The segment ran 12 minutes black and white footage of the ruins, archival stills of the trial, and a closing shot of the empty concrete slab. The narration ended on one quiet line. "Some truths are built over, not buried. The difference is only time." Viewers barely noticed the faint knocking under the closing music. Only sound technicians, years later, identified it during remastering 3 taps, rhythmic, metallic. In the provincial archive where Exhibit C had been stored, a clerk noticed an anomaly. The same week the broadcast aired, the box containing the motel key was missing. No sign of forced entry. The catalog card remained stamped, "Item returned, 1971, checked out by E. Krause." He filed a report and locked the drawer. That night, the security guard making rounds paused outside the storage room. From within came a faint sound. Click, pause, click, like a key turning in an unseen lock. He unlocked the door, shone his flashlight. The shelves were still. The air smelled faintly of smoke. He switched off the light, closed the door, and never mentioned it again. Outside, the prairie wind carried the static hum of distant radio towers. Somewhere between the signal and the silence, a voice seemed to whisper, "Room 7 is ready." And beneath the ground, where the motel once stood, the soil shifted softly, closing over the sound. Even the earth, it seemed, was reluctant to let him go.